This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so once again, thank you for joining us. We are going to have a couple presenters, kind of a panel discussion about watershed report cards, Oldham Creek, along with the other watershed report cards that are in this area, have been going for 10 years now. And so we're kind of doing a little look at how we're collecting that data and what parameters we're using. And there are other watershed report cards that have popped up in the area. So the goal is to, make them comparable so that we can all look at our large scale of our tributaries running into Lake Erie. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. If you could just wave when I say your name. And then I'm going to share our slides and they're going to give a little background about themselves. And then we have some discussion questions for them as well. So I'm going to start in the order of the pictures on my screen. So Bree Homan is the watershed coordinator for Erie Conservation District, and she's been manning the helm of our watershed report cards for 10 years now. Heath Kelsey is with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science Studies. Right. Sorry, I don't have my slide up in front of me. And his coworker, Alexander Fries, they will be talking about the creation they helped with the OWC one, the Mills Creek and Pipe Creek creation as well. And then Sandy Bin is from the Lake Erie Waterkeepers, and she'll be talking about the Western Basin report card. So I am going to share my screen. I'm going to ask that if you're not a presenter, if you can turn your cameras off, make sure you're muted. As we start here. All right. And hopefully you can see my screen.
Yep.
So Keith and Alexandra are up first, so you guys just let me know when you want me to progress with each slide.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. It's good to be here with you guys. Love to talk about report cards in general, and it's a favorite subject and topic of mine. So really happy to be here. I'm Heath Kelsey. I run the Integration and Application Network at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. I've been there for about almost 12 years, I guess. And been working on lots of report cards, including the ones for Old Creek, Pipe Creek, and Lake Erie, although Alex had a lot more to do with the Lake Erie report card. And Alex, do you want to introduce yourself real quick before we get started on our slides?
Yeah, sure. Real quick. So I'm Alex Fries, and I'm the program manager with Ian. And I've been with the university for 10 years now. And my primary role is to manage different projects, including many, many report card projects. So the Old Woman Creek report card back a long time ago was one of my first report cards, and then the Western Lake Erie report card, which recently came out last year, was one of my more recent ones that I worked on.
Great, thanks, Alex. As we've mentioned already, we've been working on ecosystem health report cards for a long time, and around the world and different contexts and things. And as we've done all this stuff, we've learned a few things. Our procedures, our process for developing the report card has changed a little bit, and the things that we focus on in the report cards has changed a little bit. So that'll be the kind of thrust of what we'll be discussing here today. So next slide. So we like to think of the ecosystem health report card as a really synthetic document that distills the main messages that's coming out from a whole bunch of data. The map on the right is from the Chesapeake Bay report card, and you can see that's one of the more recent years. We can look at the overall score in a different region of the report card, and then also look at the trends. Are things improving or are they not improving in different parts of the watershed? As you'll see in a moment, we've kind of updated what we're uh, doing with the Chesapeake Bay report card, but that's the key message. And the thing is that you can look at it and you can see immediately how things are doing in different parts of the basin and in different parts of the for different indicators overall. The pyramid on the left we call the information pyramid. The report card sits at the very top of it. It's the most synthetic part of all of the documents and process. It's a little bit low in information density, but it distills those messages and presents the results to an audience that's appropriate for things like the general public, interested public, and policy or decision makers. But what I like about this figure is that it makes clear that the report card is, while it's very synthetic, it's based on a lot of other information, data, and analysis. So we want people to understand that the report card is based on rigorous data analysis and information. The other thing that it does, it provides an avenue for people to get to the information that's right from them. We would love it if someone who picked up the report card can then go, dig deeper if they want to. If they're, part of the management community, they could take the report card, but then dig down to the level of detail and information and technical detail that's right for them. Um, so, um, so I really like that figure because it provides that transparency and also makes it clear that the report card is based on a lot of data and information. So next. To create the report cards, we for the longest time we were just focusing on this phase two, right? So the actual development of the report card as a 5-step process. But we realized as we've done these other projects that we do a lot of work beforehand, and we need to do a lot of work beforehand to kind of identify the scope and the scope of activities and issues that we'll be dealing with and geography for the report card project. And that includes a conceptual understanding of the issues, identifying stakeholders, and then planning the project. The phase two of the report card process, or is the report card process itself, we like to do that with diverse, lots of stakeholder input throughout the process. Design the report card itself. We choose indicators by consensus with the folks that are in the room based on the scope of issues that we're dealing with, determine the thresholds, calculate the grades, and then co-produce the report card itself. And then this third phase is something we've also added to our process, in that we don't just want to, present the results of the analysis and say, okay, here you are. We also want to make it really easy to get from there to things that we can do to improve conditions. And there's a host of things that we're working on now to really make that a little more quantitative and linked. So next slide. So in addition to evolving the process, we've also really changed the focus of the report card and the indicators that we're working on, including social and economic issues as well. So the report cards that we're working on now have social, cultural aspects, economic aspects, and ecosystem. And we're also adding maybe another fourth category in some cases on governance of the area. So new directions for going in indicators are more leading indicators, focusing on local economy as opposed to this macro kind of blunt instrument economic metrics. focusing a little bit more on governance, resilience, and sustainability. And then, of course, justice, equity, diversion, and inclusion are big components of the report card, which we'll see a couple of examples of in a moment. So next slide. Here's one recent report card that we worked on with WWF in Central Southern Africa for the Kafue River Basin in Zambia. And this is an example of where we've started to, our work with WWF is an example of where we've been expanding into management and governance, human health, nutrition, management and governance, and things. Oh, I've already mentioned that, in economic factors as well. So we started that with maybe the Mississippi River report card, which came out in 2015, and in 2020 was probably the first report card that we worked on that went beyond ecosystem health and really natural science things to include some of these other factors. Next slide. Another one that we're taking all this stuff that we've learned in all these other places and applying it to our first and kind of flagship report card, which is the Chesapeake Bay report card, which we've been producing since 2006. It was the first one that we worked on in the U.S., which predated Alex and me joining the university, actually. But we both worked on this and both are working on it currently. And we've expanded in a couple of different ways. One is to expand into the watershed. So in addition to the tidal portion of the Chesapeake Bay, we're now looking at watershed factors too. So looking at the health of the whole watershed. And next slide. And the next slide we'll see some of the things that we're currently working on or are currently including, and then some of the things that we're working on to include in the watershed health indicators next year. So currently we have a walkability, stewardship, heat vulnerability, and a social vulnerability index that's part of the societal portion of the report card. And in the future, we're going to include a growth index, an indicator for environmental justice, and indicators for local economic health. So we have a bunch of things in the kind of irons in the fire to work on to improve and expand the report card for Chesapeake Bay. And next slide, that might be our last one.
Yep, it was. So next up is Sandy Bin.
Sandy, you're actually on mute.
Okay, now can you hear me okay?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to get
It's
to
my
it.
fault.
Let me. Nope.
It was me. So I'm Sandy Bin, Lake Erie waterkeeper, have been that since about 2005, and we work for fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters. At the heart of it is water quality, which I think is what the report card's all about, and that's why we were interested in bringing communities together and getting the report card done. You can go to the next one, which is the Western Lake Erie report card, which we got the local governments together. The cities of Toledo, Lucas County, and the city of Oregon are the ones that funded it. And the purpose of it, really, in many ways, and the reason for it is in Western Lake Erie, we're very familiar with the algal blooms and the sizes of the blooms and the microcystin and what I call the impact side of the equation for water quality with regard to algae in particular. But the water quality side, the source side, and what's going on in the waters is the void, in my opinion, across the board pretty much. And so bringing all these people together was a really good experience. Having the data in a database is now being used. This database is being used by others to do other kinds of studies. So having water quality and criteria is really important. So as you can see, this is a regional study. It was large, so it was watersheds and the Western Basin. And the Western Basin, as we all know, is complicated with so many watersheds and then the waters of the lake itself. It's the only Great Lake that's divided in 3 basins. So this one focused on the Western Basin. And we tried to kind of relate all the different waters to each other. And it was decided that we needed just one for the lake, the Western Basin of Lake Erie itself, and then one for the watersheds that contribute to the Western Basin. And so, next slide, I think, before I get ahead of myself for a minute. So we looked at the different, this is the regions in the lake on the top with the oranges and yellows. And you can see what the indicators were for water quality, fish, and the blooms. And then you can kind of see what the grades were in each section of the lake. And so this is the first time I think that anybody's put this together and tried to define the lake in regions within the lake itself, and then what's going on in the lake with regard to what the data is telling us in terms of water quality. And then the second part of it is the watersheds that contribute to the Western Basin. And as you can see, the watersheds are, there's a lot of them, and they're all part of the puzzle that impacts water quality in Lake Erie. And so you can see the indicators that we used in terms of water quality, the landscapes, the toxics, and the biology. We had sessions with a lot of the scientists in the area to put these indicators together to agree upon them. The people from the University of Maryland are masterful at getting consensus and building that, and I'm very appreciative to them for the work that was done. There was some, one of the, the hiccups in it was some people wanted to use modeling instead of data, and I'm really glad that we were steered away from doing that. I think it's really important just to use the data. Having said that, when you use the data, and this was for 2018 that this report was based on, the data in the lake and the watersheds, as we know, the watersheds and water quality are very variable given the conditions, like rain in particular, in the spring. And so we're struggling now with the second one. And maybe you can come up to the next slide, which I just kind of did an encapsulation of some of the issues. So we're working with the University of Toledo to work with the University of Maryland to take this project over. We have funding that was actually committed this year, and we didn't do it, with Lucas County, Toledo, and Oregon. But we're looking at maybe a 3-year cycle to try and take the variability or smooth it out a bit so that we can get a better feel for if the waters are getting better or worse given rain and conditions and bloom size within the lake itself. One of the drivers in having these report cards is to make sure that we educate the public and they understand it. And, science classes as well as one of the users of the report card that we found in the schools that are using this as a tool to explain water quality in Lake Erie, which is a good thing. But in a bigger scale, it's more difficult, I think, if we don't have the history that Chesapeake has and some of the other watersheds have in terms of what trends are going on and what's going on. Ultimately, we'd like this to be, I don't know if I want to call it accountability, but at least showing whether things are getting better or worse given the conditions that we have, and giving the variability of the conditions, which is the elephant in the room, so to speak, in terms of trying to interpret the data and the scores and the grades. So with that, I'd like to hear the discussion on all this, and whatever. We didn't have the economic components and the other things that are now being added. We may in the next cycle talk to the University of Maryland and UT and include those, but I really want to, as much as you guys are veering a little bit away to other indicators and parameters, at the heart of water is really water quality and data, and it is so important to have that data to drive decisions and whatever. And so please make water quality the center of everything else, because I think it's, when you talk about the economics and the social economics and all the other pieces, I think it's really, really important that that's pivotal on water quality. And I think that's the piece that's really should be driving and at the heart of it, rather than making them maybe equal players in terms of what's going on. That's just my editorial 2 cents on the direction you're going in. I worry when we veer away from data and water quality. By the way, I'm not a scientist. I have a finance degree, an MBA, so I call myself a weird environmentalist that just loves water and has committed myself to trying to help water quality for fishing, swimming, and fish and drinking. So go ahead, Bree, take it over.
Okay, so I'm sure there's a large collection who's on the phone or on this webinar that really knows a lot about our report cards. So for those of you who aren't aware, we began monitoring in 2008, and we really started our report card process. The first one was released using our 2012 data. So we're kind of coming up on 10 years of doing report cards, and we've made some small little tweaks along the way, but once you're about 10 years into a project, just kind of like how Heath has said, you learn some things, you kind of learn some challenges, you kind of wish maybe you've done some things a little bit differently. And so we're kind of at that point where we're deciding, okay, what's the next series of report cards going to look like for our creeks? Are we getting all the messages across that we want to? Is it time to try to expand, time to kind of tweak a few things? And I've got to hand it to Sandy Bin, really helping that effort with the Western Basin develop the report cards. When we started our process, there's lots of volunteer stream monitoring programs going on. There's lots of data being collected, with government staff, with university staff, and the report cards work the best when you've got multiple report cards being developed for a particular region. So we were thrilled when we saw that the Western Basin now has their own report cards, because now we've got something to kind of compare across Lake Erie. Hopefully we'll start to see more pop up all around Lake Erie. With the Western Basin report cards, though, that was a really nice point for us to kind of relook at our own and say, hey, how do our report cards differ a little bit from theirs now? And should we try to change ours to make sure that they're more comparable? And so that's kind of where we're at right now, and why I wanted to hold this panel, because I think that next year the reality is our report cards are probably going to look a little bit different, and I like to kind of have this panel to kind of talk about some of those things. And also, hopefully there's some people on the call that might want to be interested in being kind of the next stakeholder group that really talks about the future of these report cards. So go ahead and change that. All right, so data sources that we have in our report card, and I'll kind of just talk a little bit. When you first sit down and decide, what's your message and what data are you going to use to create these report cards, I will say that I think it took us like a couple hours to create several giant post-it notes of what our report cards could be. And then over time, we had to whittle them down to say, well, what type of data are we actually getting annually? Because we decided these report cards, we wanted them coming out on an annual basis. So we really focused on just making these about water quality. And with that, it's because we knew we had a volunteer stream monitoring data and volunteer monitoring program. And really how we got started with these report cards was the fact that we were presenting this data for a few years, and we kept getting questions after we were done presenting where people just were like, well, what does that really mean though? And yeah, the charts and graphs were great, but that's just kind of not how I like to receive my information. And so we realized we needed to communicate in a different way. So in our report cards, we use both volunteer collected data and both agency collected data. Our volunteers actually collect the stream samples, and then they also, we have another set of volunteers that collect precipitation data for us all across our watersheds. For our agency partners, our office at the Conservation District, we actually do annual macroinvertebrate sampling. One of the main reasons why we don't do that with volunteers is because that requires us to trespass onto private property, and we have actually, our agency is allowed to do that for data collection, but in order to have volunteers do that, we have to have extra permissions from landowners. We also have Old Wound Creek Reserve that provides a lot of water quality data through their swamp program. So that SWMP is for system-wide monitoring program. And so it's part of a larger nationally coordinated effort to do water quality that's kind of centered around the estuary itself, but then there's also a point up in the watershed. And then, on the request of several people in our stakeholder group, we also wanted to add the beach monitoring data. Now, that's not something that's included in our score because technically that's outside of the watershed and now in the lake. But it's something that our stakeholder group felt was very important as part of the story. And so we include that as well in our report card. So go ahead and change it. I think I've got another slide. Yeah. So when we really sat down to do our report cards, we decided what was our key messages that we wanted to focus on, and then we tried to then put the pieces together to create that document. So first and foremost is we really needed to make it known that pollutants are very storm driven and that our streams are very storm driven. We knew that our monitoring was very static, and so sometimes we would hit storms and sometimes we didn't, and that could wildly change our grades, even though it's not necessarily representative of what was happening land use wise within the watershed. Another key message we wanted to get across was the fact that land use truly does affect our water quality, and so we wanted to show that the water quality can change throughout the watershed and that was usually a result of different types of land use in that watershed. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't just painting this picture of gloom and doom, but we wanted to make sure that this was our opportunity every year to tell people there's things happening in their watershed that hopefully will be driving that grade up. And then last but not least, we wanted to kind of use this as we kind of almost treat the report card as kind of like our little elevator speech. This is something that gives them a little bit of knowledge about what's going on in the watershed and tries to directly link it to a change that could be personal to the person who's reading that watershed or reading that report card. So we have different types of stewardship opportunities that we list in the watershed that are specifically tailored to what we feel are the changes that need to happen. And obviously there's a lot of overlap within them, but not every watershed report card necessarily lists the same stewardship. So, and I think that's it for me. And we can go right into the discussion. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I've got one more. Again, talking about like the messages that we were trying to get across. And remember, we started with this whole big grand idea of all these different types of indicators that we really felt told the story of watershed health. And then we had to say, well, what data do we actually have to be able to use these as annual indicators? That really whittled down what we were able to do. And again, that's why we focused a little bit more on the biggest story we wanted to talk about was water quality. So we focused on the big three, the nutrients, obviously, which is a big driver in the lake. We also wanted to focus on turbidity because in all three streams that we do report cards for, the nutrients and the sediment that was impacting the watershed was what was keeping those watersheds on the impaired list. And our whole point is to try to get these streams to be off that government impairment list. We wanted to look at macroinvertebrates, mainly because water quality, like Sandy had said, can change very rapidly, and really the chemistry information that we have is kind of just a snapshot in time, but the benthic macroinvertebrate community gives us kind of this larger look at whether or not stressors in the watershed are very chronic or not. And then again, we kind of separated our things of indicators of stream health and then also indicators of human health and safety. That's where we were able to add in that beach monitoring. So we still thought it was a critical piece. The beaches go under advisory because of usually what's coming out of the watershed. And so we wanted to make sure that we could kind of tease out having that as well, even though that's not part of our score. One of the other things that I kind of went over was our vital signs indicators. The way that this was described to me in the very beginning, which I still kind of describe, is these are like your vital signs that you would get taken by your doctor. These are the types of things that they should never really be out of range. And if they are, there's something acutely wrong with the watershed. So we've clustered all those together and given them one score. That's the things like the dissolved oxygen. Is there enough oxygen to support life? Can fish survive in it? Is your pH within range? Is your temperature within range? All of those things, if they get out of what we consider the normal range, we're going to have fish kills, or we're going to have something else severe happening in the watershed, discoloration, whatever it may be. So, okay, now I think I'm done. and we can go on to questions.
All right, let me stop sharing so we can.
Actually, why don't you advance one more slide, because I've got one slide on there to kind of show the differences between our two report cards, the Western Basin and the FCT report cards. Oh, that one.
That one.
Yeah. So one of the nice things about report cards is you want to be able to compare them. And you can kind of see there that our report cards are very comparable to many of the indicators, but there's some indicators that we just don't have the data for. And this is, I guess, where we're kind of facing right now is where should we start to improve our watershed report cards so that we can be a little bit more consistent with the Western Lake Erie Basin.
All right. Bree, do you want me to leave this up, or you want to look at faces for the discussion?
Yeah, so I think I kind of went through how we already decided on our indicators, but maybe we can also hear kind of from Sandy about their discussion.
Yeah, Sandy, how did you guys select the indicators that you included in your report card?
We had all the scientists in the room, and we kind of put them all up on the board, and then the University of Maryland looked for where there was data. I mean, that's always what has to drive it. And so I think on some of these, there was a lot of data on total phosphorus. I know there was more than on DRP. So that was included because there was a lot of data for it. I'm a little surprised on the fish issue that you guys, I don't know if it's not reported or do you just not have it. Not sure what that, I can skip back to the vital signs, the pH and the DO and stuff. I don't think that information was readily available to be able to include that in this report card. Maybe either Heath or that you guys can comment on if you remember on that particular piece.
I'll have to let Alex describe actually what was available and what wasn't. But one of the things that does come out of this process is almost invariably we identify things that we wish we had, and then we don't. So it points out really clearly gaps in the data that you wish you had. But Alex, can you speak to the availability in the Western Lake Erie?
Yeah, I can say that for sediment, we had more TSS data than turbidity data. Like all the regions in the watershed had TSS data except for one, which had turbidity data. So that's why we chose TSS. For vital signs, we didn't really get into vital signs for the watershed. We talked about dissolved oxygen for the lake, and it was like determined it wasn't a good indicator for the lake because of the lake conditions. But I think, if we wanted to add kind of the vital sign type indicators for the watershed, that would be appropriate, and there should be data to support pH, DO, and temperature. And I guess maybe I shouldn't speak for Bree, but the fish that we used in the lake are 3 specific species, and so I don't remember having any fish data at the time we started the Old Woman Creek report card, but that was also a very long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we didn't include things like fish consumption, mainly because there was data out in the lake, but we kept ours directly to the streams themselves. And the only fish data we actually had was the bioassessment that was done by the EPA. And that assessment was done, I think in Old Woman Creek, I want to say it was maybe done in 2005 or 2006. And in Pipe Creek and Mills Creek, I think it was done in 2015, and it hasn't been done since. So again, we would come up with these things like, oh, we would love to have this, but if we're trying to do an annual report card and we're not getting annual data, then we decided to just abandon that as an indicator because it was just something that would never change over time, even though all the other indicators were changing.
Yeah, and the
Um,
fish for the lake are very different, like, because they're, commercially important species. They're like monitored all the time. So yeah, as I remember from visiting Old Woman Creek that it's very shallow and not a lot of fish there. Not that you don't have them, but I don't think the same type of indicator would actually like work in your system.
yeah,
I
we
think
would
this
be
point,
counting darters and minnows and maybe some
yeah,
sunfish in the estuary.
but I think this points out, one of the things that we've come to also is that, the actual species and communities that you look at might be different. So the things you're measuring might be different, but you might be able to develop an indicator for fish that is appropriate for your system. And so you could say, okay, well, for our system, our fish score is this. And so we've kind of been working on this idea that we could develop categories of indicators, but the actual things within them might be a little bit different depending on the system that you're working in. Because, like we just said, the species of fish that you look in for a healthy fish population in the lake might be really different than in the estuary. So that's one of the approaches we're pursuing for larger systems and systems where we're trying to compare among different places.
So one thing I didn't put in this, I kind of was just comparing what the indicators were and what the measurements were. And for the most part, our measurements, even though, there's TSS and turbidity, they still kind of refer to the same thing. So, I mean, I still feel that they're pretty comparable. One thing that we did find in our process, or when I was reviewing the two, was that some of our thresholds were very, very similar and some of our thresholds were a little bit different. So something that we're going to be doing over this winter is we're going to be looking at all of our, hold on a second, guys. One of the things that, sorry, I'm in a big group office. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at is our threshold, specifically nitrate, is what we found may have been a bit too stringent, and also is not really in line with how the Western Lake Erie Basin has done their thresholds. And we are going to be adjusting that threshold to make sure that we're more consistent with the Western Lake Erie Basin. And so we are going to kind of backdate some things as well too, and just kind of see how our scores may have changed over time. But like I said, the power in these report cards is your ability to compare all these different regions together. And so we do need to make sure that as new report cards kind of come online, that they still are kind of this apples to apples comparison. And again, for us, we're 10 years in, and it's time for us to kind of reevaluate our process and see what we need to do. So,
Yep.
And we're still new in this, but I just want to add that one of the things on the dissolved oxygen, like in the Western Basin, because it turns over so much, we don't usually have a dissolved oxygen issue. We certainly do in the watersheds, but not in the lake itself. And Bree, one of the things that was just coming to mind, one thing to share is, because I think I've talked to the people at Herb, and it's definitely going forward, is there's another report card coming out up in the Raisin, which we actually did, so it'll overlap a bit, which is fine. And then the Detroit River and the Clinton, we're kind of asking them if they would include Lake St. Clair in theirs, just because strangely, when we did our report card, Lake St. Clair was data void. It was really old and it was really bad. And some of the scientists actually called us on it. And University of Maryland folks actually said, if you can show us the data, we'd be glad to put it in, and it didn't exist. So if you know the lake and kind of how the waters come down to Lake Erie, they come down from Huron and then through the St. Clairs and then down through the Detroit and in. But I guess the other point I just want to make people aware that that's taking place, and it would be interesting in the future for us to compare theirs as well and what they're doing. But the other report card that I really would like to see done is the Central Basin and the watersheds, because you're right on the edge of the Western and Central. So as you may be adjusting your nitrates, it may be different for the Central Basin than it is for the Western Basin. I don't know that, but I'm just tossing that out as something to consider.
So I feel like I should have mentioned this before, but Alex and I are working closely with the Herb Foundation on those 5 report cards for the Detroit area, including the Huron, Clinton, Raisin Rouge, and the Detroit River. And so that's one of the things that, we wanted to talk about here because of this idea that we should be developing things that are comparable. Brianne, one of the things you just mentioned was that you may be adjusting the thresholds for nitrate to be more in line with what the folks in the Lake Erie report card did. And I just wanted to make you aware, I'm sure we talked about this at the time, but even within the Chesapeake Bay, we have different regions with different thresholds. Just the area is just, there's different salinity regimes, different depth and geographies, and the appropriate nutrient, chlorophyll, and other water quality conditions are just different. And so we have different thresholds for different regions within even within the one system of the Chesapeake Bay. So I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing if your nitrate thresholds are a little bit different than what are in the lake. But I'm not saying they shouldn't. They should be the same, or they shouldn't be. But it isn't inconceivable that you might have different conditions and therefore warrant a different threshold.
Right, and I guess I should try to clarify. So this actual comparison that I have here is actually just the watersheds compared to the watersheds. So there's a little bit slightly different criteria for the lake. And what we actually found, when we were looking at threshold to threshold on each parameter from watershed to watershed, it basically, if there was a difference, then I kind of went back, what was our process? Why did we select what we did? And then, is that appropriate now? Or do we know something differently and it should be changed? So actually, Alex and I had a long conversation that maybe the nitrate selection that we made was a little bit too stringent because our watersheds are failing it every single time that we sample. I mean, they almost never pass. And so usually you're trying to at least get your rises and your falls. And so if we're failing it all the time, is it too stringent? And we went back to the research behind it, and lo and behold, we kind of had a range to pick in, and we picked the most stringent side of it, and we actually did have wiggle room. And so now we're trying to decide, okay, is it too hard of a threshold to meet? Maybe our streams didn't need to be kept quite to this standard, And so and that's what I think we're going to try to sort through this winter, specifically with nitrate. So Alex, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
I think you pretty much covered it. I think it's kind of like what you were saying, like you started doing this a long time ago. So we do want to make sure that everything is still relevant and accurate. And if we do have more information, then adjusting thresholds as needed or even indicators, I think it's the time now to do that. I do feel like Western Lake Erie needs, to repeat a few more times before making any drastic changes. But obviously that'll be up to Sandy and the University of Toledo, who's going to be taking it over.
And to that point, what I'm seeing what's being done here is the watersheds are being done annually, and you've got smaller streams. We've got the Raisin's a big one, so it'll be interesting to see how you guys handle that. I don't know how many sub watersheds or whatever there are in the Clinton, but the Raisin I'm somewhat familiar with. It's not as bad as the Maumee, but it's definitely an issue. So I'm just wondering if the way we've done our report card and the way we're going to do it, I think we're going to cycle it in 3-year cycles, but we're going to have annual data because of the lake, so we can relate the watersheds to the lake. I don't know how else to do it because the lake has such different responses. I mean, very, very different responses to rainfall in the spring and the size of the blooms, which is a driver of a lot of the work that public interest that's going on. So how do we get that to be meaningful to the public, and then explain the watershed role in that lake water quality in a meaningful way. We did regions and stuff in the watersheds for Western Lake Erie. Maybe we need to go back and look at how those are broken up in the watersheds, given what's being done on the others. And especially since the Huron, Clinton, and Raisin are part of that, do we just break it out and not do it again? Or how does this all come together? It's a really good timing for the decision, because we're having this discussion right now on funding the report card next year and the scope and scale of it. So, I think we need to think it through a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation too, because as we start our conversations with particularly the Raisin folks, this overlap is something that we're going to have to be really aware of, and our ability to coordinate is going to be really important. I think this is great that we're having this discussion. So yeah, we'll be in touch for sure over the next year or so in how to coordinate at least these water quality indicators for the Raisin.
Well, and if the Raisin and Huron and Clinton are being done and we're part of the first Western Lake Erie watershed, maybe we let those now go to the new watersheds where they're doing it just by that watershed, and then maybe we go deeper into the Maumee and the other rivers that are remaining that are not being individually addressed. I mean, the Maumee is the gigantic one, and obviously there's the portage that's coming out. I don't think we included the Sandusky. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think we did. I think we did, because that Sandusky is always funky in terms of where it's at. So we might be able to take a deeper dive into those and just think about watersheds instead of the way we did it, and maybe do watersheds in the lake and separate them a bit more, or try to tie them together. And Lake St. Clair is the other question mark in terms of how that fits into all this. But the impacts of the watershed on the lake are really important, and the lake itself is really important. So and just ad-libbing a little bit, I saw something last night in some research or something that basically was saying, I mean, we do a lot of cyanobacteria and a lot of stuff with regard to algae in the lake, but they were like assuming that there's no heavy metal problem or whatever in the lake. And I don't know if the Chesapeake's ever done it, but it certainly is never done in Lake Erie, and I don't think it's been done in any of the Great Lakes where they've ever really looked for what's on the bottom and what's going on. When we get the dead zones in the Cleveland area, and the manganese and the heavy metals that are there come to mind. And, we don't do areas of concern which are unique to the Great Lakes in the lakes themselves. And at some point, maybe some of us just need to look at how that affects, what's already on the bottom is affecting water quality, not only nutrients on the bottom, which they do look at, but the heavy metals and stuff that were dumped in the lake over the years that definitely are there and probably play a factor in some stuff.
Yeah, we were part of the first Baltimore Harbor report card effort, and that actually they were in the news just the last couple of days. They're trying to advocate for water sports and the ability to swim in Baltimore Harbor within the next several years, which I still find very dubious. But but toxic and heavy metals. Toxic contaminants and heavy metals in the sediment in the harbor were certainly big issues. And I think where we came down, though, was that nobody was really collecting those data very regularly. They didn't expect them to change very much. And so they got an assessment done, and it's like, yeah, this is what's in here. It's not going away. It's not like, things are going to fluctuate from year to year. So they may do it. And actually, I don't know if there are any plans to redo that on a regular basis at all. But just an acknowledgement of that as a big issue, especially for places where you've got lots of shipping and shipbuilding sometimes, and industry can be a real big issue.
One of the strange
that was definitely the results, Heath, that it was like no one was monitoring it, and it was too long of a time scale to change.
And it's really expensive.
Yeah, one of the things that's been interesting is on the issue of the metals and stuff on the bottom is in the Western Basin, we have such flow and oxygen levels that it remains in situ most of the time and doesn't get, because of the depletion of the oxygen, which is usually what causes the sediments to rise. And that's happening in the Cleveland area, in the central basin of Lake Erie, in their intakes. This year it happened again. So when you get a dead zone, the sediments rise and then it releases it. That debate, strangely, on a farm issue here that people are looking at is also being reaffirmed in that there's a lot of phosphorus here in the Western Basin in the sediments. That's a fact. But because we don't get the dead zones, it doesn't seem to be being released. However, in the streams, in the watersheds themselves, when the oxygen goes down, then the nutrients are released in the low moving streams. So it's just I don't know, it's an interesting piece. And maybe because they're in situ and they don't move much, people feel they don't have to do anything about it. I don't know. That's off the subject.
So,
Sorry.
yes, I want to make sure that we provide some time for our participants to ask some questions. So I'm going to put this open to question and answer session. So we're pretty casual on these. If you want to come off mute and ask a question, or if you want to type it in the chat, I'm happy to read out the question for you. Thank you, Heath and Sandy and Alexandra and Bree. I know that our report cards are highly valued, and our constituents really like seeing them released every year. And they are a great educational tool for me as someone who works with the public. That I use them all the time. So all the work that goes into them is amazing, and we appreciate it so much. So if anyone has any questions.
I might just add that Alex is going to have to leave us in about 5 minutes, I think. So if there are any questions of a technical nature for any of these report cards, Alex is the one to ask. I'm up here now, just like pulling strings, and Alex is doing the work.
Rosie, did you have a question?
Yes. I know how important water quality is across the country, across the state, and I'm surprised that has anybody, I know you or the Maryland and the Old Lemon Creek and Bree are, coordinating, but is there any hope of having a statewide coordination of water quality record keeping, or is it just all hit and miss? And whoever makes friends with somebody else, that's how it happens?
I don't think it's really hit or miss. I think that the time scales, are not exactly set up to be really good community motivators. So, the EPA has really charged all the state environmental agencies, whether it's another state EPA or whether it's like a DEQ or some combo of that. They're charged with assessing streams, and that's what puts a stream on that impairment list. So they do have to identify it, and they're supposed to come back periodically and survey it again and decide whether or not something's improved or not. I think the problem is, and the reality is, think about how many streams we have just in Ohio, and I don't even think all Ohio streams have been sampled yet. So as the EPA is kind of going around and sampling all these streams, what it took them 20 years to come back to the Cuyahoga and do another assessment, which it's great that they have, but I think it really kind of shows that they're limited in their capacity. So I think that's where it makes it really, there's kind of this niche for volunteers, citizen science. There's also this niche for universities and local governments to kind of fill the gaps a little bit. And that's really why we started our voluntary monitor program, is because we didn't want to wait 20 years to then evaluate ourselves and to keep that message of water quality in people's minds. We figured if we were coming out annually and reminding people that there's changes needed and that the stream's not where we want it to be, that's what route we went. So they're out there. The problem is, I think the time scales and the capacity to try to do them more frequent is just not there.
Too bad.
Yeah. we've actually run into this issue primarily when we were doing the Mississippi River report card. We were looking for data sets that would span all of that basin in a very consistent way. And we first went to the impaired waters list, which, as you said, Bree, the states are mandated to do this. But we also found that the states do it so differently. Their criteria for what they say is impaired is different. Their uses for the waters are different, and their sampling and attainment processes are just different. And so comparing across states using those data is just not possible. Then the EPA told us that in the end. They pointed us to it, and then we started getting into it. Oh, no, you shouldn't use it for this. But there is another one that they have, the rivers and streams assessment, which is done consistently it should be every 3 or 5 years or so. Over the last 8 years, there's been some giant time lags in there, but the more recent one just came out, and it's great, but it only comes out every 5 years, and it's really based on a limited amount of sampling, both temporally and spatially. So it's good to use at something like the scale of the Mississippi River Basin, but it's not going to be useful that much for smaller watersheds.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in really briefly and say in the Chesapeake Bay program started this thing called the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which is to use all of this, like they call it non-traditional monitoring. So volunteer citizen science monitoring, and get that data and information into the Chesapeake Bay program data, which is Chesapeake Bay program is part of the EPA. So like they recognize that there are these problems monitoring, on a, frequent time scale. And so this whole project that we did it for 6 years, and now it's another 6-year cycle, is to incorporate all of these like desperate groups together and say, what is their data really showing? Do they have quality, approval plans, like all of that minutia to be able to support the Chesapeake Bay watershed itself to have more data that's not just collected by the EPA. So, I don't know if maybe in the future, there's no Lake Erie program, but if Lake Erie could start a program like that to get these groups, using all the data so that like the different states can use their data too, and they don't have to say like, well, we don't know if the quality of their data is not good enough for our, methods, then like that could fill in a lot of those like holes temporally and spatially.
So we have 2 projects going on right now. Well, the Ohio EPA came out with the Qualified Data Collector program, which I think that was kind of one of their hopes, was that it would kind of centralize everybody on kind of similar, comparable collected data. Another project that's going on right now that's being led by Cleveland Water Alliance is they're doing that very same thing that you guys did in Chesapeake. They're trying to get all of these smaller citizen science projects together. And right now we're going through the process of we're comparing really the minutia of all of our programs. We're checking how are they developed, how are they evaluated, what's the QA/QC behind what data is being collected, what's the frequency, and we're kind of stacking them all together to kind of see what data is being collected where and how credible is it. And so stay tuned. If you guys want to learn more about it, it's Cleveland Water Alliance who's leading the charge. And the project that they're working on, it's got a couple different names, but one of them is called Great Lakes One Water. And this isn't just a Lake Erie. They're actually coordinating amongst the Great Lakes, because their idea is, how do we do some similar citizen science data collection throughout the Great Lakes system? So we're only 2 years into the project, so we're still kind of starting off. But so far, it's been really neat to kind of hear from different organizations on what they're collecting and why they're doing it, and what messages they're doing, and then what data products they're creating with it. So
that's
hopefully
fantastic.
more report cards.
But also know that No, Ohio, there's the ruling on the TMDL is in the courts is coming out for the Western Basin soon. And so there's supposed to be some agreement between the parties. And that could play a role, or at least everybody should be aware of what that is or isn't doing in terms of all the rest of the stuff that's going on.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Any other final questions or thoughts? Heath, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all right. I don't want to. I want to make sure everybody has time for questions too. But I had one other to follow up on Bree's last comments. You know, Alex and I, again, what year was that, Alex? We started the MTAC group. It was, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. We started this group to get those watershed organizations together and do exactly what you're doing, like comparing methods and frequency and you know, spatial distribution of sampling things. And we came out with these protocols that said, okay, this is what, you know, based on the consensus of all these groups, this is what we think you guys, you know, the minimum that should be done if you're going to, you know, do this kind of stuff. And here's the Cadillac version. So there was some recognition that, you know, lots of groups didn't have a lot of money, but those protocols exist still. And then those are, I think, what spurred the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative a little bit to take that a step further.
Great,
Jen,
thank you.
if you don't mind me making a quick plug right now too.
Go for it, Bree.
So we're going to start the process of really reevaluating the Firelands Coastal Tributaries report cards. So this is Mills Creek, Pipe Creek, and Old Woman Creek. Again, right now, our report cards are really just a reflection of the water quality. But you guys heard some things from Heath and Alex and Sandy about some parameters that we're not currently looking at that maybe we can investigate including in our next version. So if there's anyone on this call that is just super excited to be part of that process, please send an email to Jen, because my hopes is to have maybe a report card brainstorming session again in probably November, December timeframe. And we can start kind of beginning our process on converting our watersheds or converting the report cards and maybe updating these report cards a little.
Yep, and I threw my email in there. Alexandra, thank you for putting yours in. I do have contact information for each of our speakers today, so if you would like to ask them further questions, you can let me know. And I have one final thing to do for our last brown bag of the year. So, Carrie, you want to come off? We have had a PhD student working with us on her research on environmental education programs. So, Carrie?
Yeah.
I'm going to put up your slide, okay?
Yes, thank you. I will wait for it.
It's coming. Here we go.
All right. So yeah, like Jen said, I am a PhD student at Bowling Green State University, and I am researching basically how people develop pro-environmental behaviors like recycling or planting a pollinator garden or whatever. And one of the things that I suspect really impacts this process is attending environmental education events like this. So I have a survey that I would love if you took some time to take for me. It should be about 10 minutes, and there is a drawing for an Amazon gift card at the end if you want to enter for that. Yeah, and if you have any questions, I'll post my email in the chat too. It's also on this little slide. I'll post a link to the survey in the chat, but there's also a shortened link and a QR code on the slide too that you should be able to scan. Yeah, thank you.
So, Carrie, is this open to really wide nationwide audience, or is this a targeted kind of geography you're looking at?
I'm looking at people who attend events in the Lake Erie region. Okay. So I have like a few specific events picked out like this one, and I'm just looking at these people that come to these events. And you, if you want to take it, you can too. You were here.
Well, an Amazon card, I could use that.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists for your time and all the effort that has gone into making the report cards what they are today. I hope everyone gets a chance to go out and enjoy some of the sunshine that we're having in our Lake Erie area. I don't know what it's like in Maryland today, but it's a lovely fall day today. Okay, good. I'm glad it's nice by you as well. All right, so thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and we will see you all for brown bags next year.
Thanks, everybody. That was fun.